My name is Victoria Flowers. I'm the Environmental Compliance Coordinator for the Oneida Nation, and I work in our Compliance Assistance Program for underground storage tanks. I'd like to welcome you to this session where we're going to talk about underground storage tank equipment. I've invited 3 experts to help me discuss this very complicated topic and to let you in on a few pieces of information that they've learned throughout the years working with underground storage tanks. I'd like to introduce my panel to you now.
Hi, I'm Brad Hoffman. I'm Vice President of Engineering and R&D for Tanknology. I've got over 30 years of experience in the UST industry. Tanknology has a fleet of inspectors and field technicians who provide testing and inspections on tanks all across the country. So I look forward to helping to participate in this conversation today.
Hi, I'm Jeff Jerzanowski. I'm with Source North America Corporation. We're one of the largest fueling system distributors in the country. We have warehouses from coast to coast. I personally, as Brad, have been in the industry over 30 years and I'm recognized as a fueling system infrastructure and compatibility expert. And I look forward to the opportunity to working with you as well.
Hi, I'm Ryan Hare. I'm with EPA, Office of Underground Storage Tanks. I work in the Release Prevention Division. Unlike these two 30-year veterans, I have 8 years working with EPA. Primarily, our job is to prevent releases. The other half of the office works with cleaning up releases. My job within that is working a lot with new fuels and dealing with corrosion problems and compatibility issues. And I rely a lot on these 2 experts. So this is a great panel. We appreciate the opportunity to participate. Thank you.
I'd first like to start by asking Jeff, who has a lot of experience with the actual parts and pieces, how many parts make up a UST system? Particularly, how many components are before the shear valve, which is regulated by the EPA, and then those parts that come after the shear valve?
Your typical fueling system, including from the PV vent, I call it, all the way through to the tip and nozzle, is about 60 components. But if you try to back out those that are governed under Fire Prevention Code, which is above the impact valve, you're still about 50 to 55 components governed under EPA. And then with the stuff above ground, above the impact valve, the shear valve, typically that's 5 or 6. That would be your nozzles, hoses, swivels, breakaways, and also the filter actually, which sometimes gets forgotten about. That number changes vastly in quantity, obviously depending on the fueling points. But overall, your system's made up of up to 55 to 60 components on average.
So for all these components that exist in the fueling system, what, Ryan, is the most important consideration for those?
That they work. I think that, I don't know, can you elaborate a little bit more on the question? I think a consideration, from my perspective, one of the things that I deal with is making sure whatever fuel you have is intended to be, or whatever components you have are intended to be used with the fuel that you're going to put in it. You know, some components aren't compatible with other, with some of the fuels. And fuels change over time. So this is something that continues to evolve. Every few years we get new and different fuels. So we always want to make sure those we're using the right components with the right fuels.
Thanks, Ryan. Brad, are you able to share with us what are some of the most common things that you see go wrong with fueling system components related to the types of fuels that are being used?
Well, there's a number of things. As Jeff mentioned, 50 or 60 components. And some of the ones that we might hear a little bit more about is like a tank or a pipe when they leak into the ground. And that does happen. It's not as common today as it may have been 30 years ago when there were quite a few liquid releases on a regular basis. So that still does occur, but not as often. what we tend to see a lot more of is the components that are accessible from grade level, caps and adapters and fittings and nozzles and anything with moving parts. And especially if they come into contact with either users or with equipment operators, snow plows, delivery drivers, those parts tend to get a lot of interaction. They tend to get a lot of degradation if there's any gaskets or elastomers. Some of those parts, when they fail, they may not cause an immediate release of fluid. Sometimes they cause an intrusion of water, whether it's groundwater that gets into the system or sometimes just surface water and rain. So that's a big thing to check for, to make sure that all of those parts are tight and sealed and things are working properly.
You used a term I'm not familiar with. What is elastomer?
Well, it's just anything that's a type of a rubber. I kind of use that in a broad basis. In our industry, there's, the caps typically would have a type of a rubber gasket under them. And they should be compatible with the liquid being stored. It may be a type of Buna or nitrile rubber or perhaps Viton or something like that. And they will hold up for a period of time, but they can harden or crack and degrade. Or in some cases, they just go missing mysteriously. And if that's the case, your cap is not going to seal right. And if you get water up there, it's going to get into the underground storage tank and cause problems.
Thanks. What are the most important considerations for equipment when you're building a new station? I'm not talking about layout. I'm talking about the pieces of equipment that you select.
Is that for me, Vicki?
I guess from a repair and testing perspective, and then let's hear from Jeff, since he's got some experience in also looking at setting up stations.
From our experience, there are failure rates of equipment. We do not try to favor or even report about a particular brand or a particular type of material typically. Some clients just may have a preference. For tanks, for instance, the primary materials would be steel and fiberglass. And we've seen both of those be able to operate successfully if they are used with the types of fuel, as Ryan mentioned, that were designed to be stored in that container. And also, if they prevent water intrusion that may cause corrosion and degradation and other fuel quality issues that give you problems. There are many, many other components, like I mentioned before. Spill containers are a large source of problems, and in different parts of the country, they get subjected to different types of wear and tear. So that's a very high maintenance item, and I can't really recommend one brand or type over another, but it's something that I think any operator should consider their own experience and really try to pick the ones that hold up the best.
This is Jeff. I agree with Brad and Ryan also. If you're building a new station, compatibility is key. But the one thing I'd like to add is that our fuels are going to continue to change. We're continually looking at moving more and more in the direction of renewable fuels and renewable fuels. So, we only rebuild about 2.5% of the stations a year. So once you build that station, that equipment has to last a long time. So we encourage you to make that as universal as possible. So don't just look at the fuels that you're going to supply today. Take into consideration the fuels that you may be selling 3, 5, 10 years from now. So try to make that equipment as compatible as possible. And Vicki, going back to the point about site layout, that actually is an important consideration. We get requests from marketers that, they really want to put more dispensers in than is really safe to get proper access in and out. The tank truck routing, the worst thing you could do at a site is have a tank truck that has to back up to deliver fuel. So those things are important considerations, but it also affects as well the equipment. So for instance, where that tank pad is, if that tank pad with all those manholes is in a high transportation area, meaning cars are going to be running back and forth a lot over there, that's going to impact the wear and tear on those manholes and the seals, as Brad keeps mentioning. That's critical. The other thing to take into consideration is your environment. We're up here where it gets chilly and we get snow. Snow plow rings on manholes is an important thing. Those things are taken into consideration. Or water table. We've been at sites, all of us together, doing inspections where you have a lot of runoff from either snow melt or from rain. And if you don't have the right type of spill buckets or manholes, you'll have an additional problem with water intrusion. So looking around at the environment, the layout of your site, where some of these things are going to be placed, it is important to take note on all that as you take consideration of the type of equipment that you're going to install.
Thanks. Ryan, when it comes to selecting equipment for a new station or a new build, does EPA care what kind of material my equipment is made out of? If it needs to meet certain criteria for the environment that I'm building in?
Yeah, so we have installation requirements in the underground storage tank regulation. They require you use equipment and you install it according to a national standard for installation. So I believe in the national standard for installation that I would have to check this. Brad, you might be better able to comment on this, but the equipment in that standard requires that you use certain equipment that is proven to meet some type of a standard. I don't think it necessarily has to have a UL listing, but I could be wrong on that. So maybe Brad, can you weigh in on that? I'm not an expert in that area. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would prefer to defer this to Jeff. A lot of the equipment I think Source has created this chart of, I don't want to speak out of turn, Jeff, but a code of where you need, or a matrix of where you may need a fire code approval for particular components that may be in addition to like an EPA component, because there's kind of a basic EPA compatibility requirement that is, I think, a little more broad. And then there's some specific fire code requirements where some components must be listed. So it can get a little bit complicated when you get to all of those 50 or 60 parts. Jeff, do you want to elaborate a little bit more?
One thing I would add is that, we don't expect everybody to be an expert on equipment. But the fact is, each state typically has procedures in place to certify those contractors that do the work. So not only will they be required to know the EPA requirements in the National Fire Prevention requirements, but they will also be required to know what the state or local requirements are. So really, what I would like to recommend is that wherever you're at, you really should talk to your contractor for those things. So we do have requirements based on EPA regulations, 40 CFR 280 series, and then with the biofuels part 32. That covers everything from the PV vent, the vent at the end, all the way to the fire valve or impact valve under dispenser. Then typically things covered from above the impact valve, shear valve, are covered by National Fire Prevention Code, NFPA 30A. And they all, doesn't matter if it's EPA or fire code, they all require compatibility in some form of showing compatibility. Some states require that you present that in documentation when you go to build a site. So, but legacy sites that are pre-existing are one issue. The sites have been rebuilt and upgraded slowly in comparison to a site being built new today. When you build a site new today or rebuild a site, the whole fueling system, the materials that you're going to buy brand new are all built to certain standards, which covered almost all fuels today. It's really when you get into higher than E10 or V20, it's to be where you may have to think about which component that you're going to use. But once again, talk to your contractor, your equipment provider. We really are trying to move the industry to make that a universal norm so it becomes less of an issue. But if you're building new, it should be less of an issue when we talk about those things.
Thanks, Jeff. And this is Ryan again. So I just pulled up the regulation here to talk about it or to build on that. The The tanks and the piping do have some specific criteria that require it to be listed to a standard, as you know, and everything Jeff mentioned there was totally accurate. What the other components in the piping, from EPA's perspective, we don't really lay out specifics for what that equipment must be certified to. We just say what it must do. And I'll give an example. For spill and overfill equipment, we say you just have to use some spill and overfill prevention equipment that will prevent release of product to the environment. And it, you know, a couple other criteria for how it must, you know, stop an overfill, you know, at what percentage point, but we don't lay out the specifications of the product itself. But we do say you have to use an overall installation standard to, you know, to follow certain procedures. But as Jeff just said there, all of these components that are really going to be used and you have the opportunity to buy meet those standards, or they wouldn't be in the market now. So I hope that gives a little more context to my answer. Sometimes the states are a little bit more prescriptive, and smaller jurisdictions could be a little bit more stringent than ours.
You brought up something in that last set of discussions that we had around legacy sites and changes in fuels. The original tank regulations came out in 1988 and set sort of a limited criteria for underground storage tanks, parts, and pieces. And the regulations were recently updated in 2015. Oftentimes I've heard from tribes across the country inquiring about, if I'm buying an old gas station that's suddenly coming up for sale, what are things I have to be aware of? Starting with Brad, can you share with us some of the challenges you've identified with older gas stations and new fuels for that matter?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vicki. We have a lot of clients we help when they acquire sites from other operators. And there's a lot that really needs to be done, and it usually involves a very thorough survey to really understand what is at the site. And this should start with a survey of any paperwork, any actual receipts and documentations, permits, anything that can demonstrate what sort of tank and piping system is installed and under what permit does it operate. In addition to that, we really highly recommend an on-site survey done by a knowledgeable person, perhaps a contractor, to check basic things. Is it a steel tank or a fiberglass tank? What is the diameter? What is the size? It will impact things like your leak detection. A majority of sites today probably have an automatic tank gauge for leak detection if they're a single wall tank. And we find a lot of operators get sites that have incorrect information that's been put in because hard to believe, but over the years, it may be the actual, size and capacity of that tank may have been mixed up. They run it as a 10,000 gallon when it's really a 12,000 gallon. So it's really important to try to investigate that. In addition, as you mentioned, if it's an older site and if its age is, prior to the time when the materials were made to be compatible with the current fuels, then it may be a time to step back and say, I need to upgrade part of this system before it will be able to handle, say, E10, or certainly, if you go to higher blends, E15 or B20, things like that. So there's really a lot of surveying and highly detailed to check all of the components to make sure they are compatible. And then again, along with that, it will help the operator to understand what their operating requirements are going to be. What sort of periodic tests are going to be required for that site? What sort of leak detection system is operating, and who is going to monitor that, and what sort of results they should expect to see usually on a monthly basis, but also on a daily basis. So a lot goes into that.
I totally agree with Brad. Really, the survey is critical. The survey is basically giving you the full bill of health, like going to a doctor's office and getting a total checkup to make sure that everything is okay. And it should be done by a qualified contractor. Too often, Someone will hire someone to go out and do a survey at their site to find out that they didn't do a good job. So you end up paying more money to get somebody that's really qualified, somebody like a technology, to go out there and do the survey. And what a survey requires is that the contractor actually takes off and opens every single manhole cover, opens up every gas pump door and takes a look. Because we've run into situations where a contractor will take off the manhole cover at the submersible, they'll see a green flex pipe, and they presume the whole site is piped with that same pipe. And then when we go to do an upgrade, they pull off the doors and they find out one or two legs going from one dispenser to another had a leak later on. And because that other manufacturer may not have been around anymore, they pulled a different color pipe. So it's two different manufacturers. So a real solid quality survey has to be done. It should be maintained. Any maintenance after that is done should be documented with that survey. And so you should not only be thinking about biofuels, although we're going that way, you're really assessing the quality of your system, and if any of that equipment is at its life's end. We know that as we get to underground storage tanks, even though some manufacturers say they're warranted for 30 years and they could go as long as the environment's good, the reality is insurance underwriters don't like insuring them past 30 years. They start increasing the premiums when you start getting towards the end of the 20s. So those things all have to be taken into consideration. Even doing a real good survey, we can't always see stuff. Sometimes there's manifolds that are buried underground. They're not inside sumps. In the market areas that used to have stage 2, there may be stage 2 piping that has been shut off at the dispenser, but it's buried at the tank. You can't always see that. We find out at gas stations that used to have service bays that then turned into C-stores. Especially in the older cities, you'd be amazed at how many underground storage tanks are filled and buried down there, that when you're buying the property, those may be existing as well. So the survey is the key thing.
Jeff, with that survey, do you also generally do a survey of the soil to look for possible releases that are undiscovered?
Brad, that would be more of a question to you, since you do, when there's acquisitions and stuff done, you guys actually do those surveys.
Yeah, the technology does not provide that particular survey, but I know some of our clients would, to do a background, to do some soil samples to see any existing levels of contamination. And then often they like to establish that they're receiving a system that is in fully functional, fully operational condition. So, you know, if they would hire technology, we would usually go in and do a tightness test of all of the components, do an operational test of things like the overfill prevention system, the automatic tank gauge system, the sump sensors and things like that. So to kind of draw a line in the sand to say, okay, at this point in time, everything is functional, there are no leaks, and we're moving forward. But again, technology doesn't provide it, but some clients, before they acquire a site, would do an environmental, like a phase 1 and assessment of the property to see what contamination may exist already that would be the responsibility of the prior owner to clean that up. So that's Ryan, very wise to do that.
Yeah, Ryan, that's a great question, because I believe that actually any bank loaning money, they're the ones that are going to require that, because they do not want to take on that risk and liability. So I do believe that's part of the process, but that would be outside the scope of what, a company like technology or your typical petroleum house would not be involved with. That'd be more of an environmental company.
With the whole UST world, as we all know, when it's all out of sight, out of mind, I guess if you're buying the site, it's almost, more so if you are the bank insuring the person buying the site. I can see that they want you to do as much as they reasonably can to, test everything. And as Brad said, kind of, draw that baseline of where things are, because we know a lot of these, as you guys have said, have been in the ground for a long time. And probably a lot of the components are good for a long time into the future, but you never know what happened in the past.
Yeah, there are various levels of surveys that can be done. We offer enhanced surveys. Just kind of put my salesman hat on. You all have probably seen some of our internal tank inspection videos. And, as we've talked about, there's some equipment that has a stated warranty period, and it may be rated for 30 years. And some states have started to come out with regulations to say you can't operate equipment after the warranty period. But we've actually been able to help some tank owners, some of our clients, to kind of evaluate their assets to say, hey, they're getting near that age where the warranty may be expiring. What condition is it in? And we've seen older tanks, both steel and fiberglass, that are still in good shape after 30 years. We've also seen other ones of that age or maybe not quite so old that are showing signs of degradation. And of course, on leaks, a lot of our clients have us, put our camera inside the tank when there is a failure or water ingress, and we observe some of those. So it's just a tool to consider to say, hey, I have something a little bit older. Is there another way to really check to see how it's holding up?
Thanks. That was a great topic of discussion, and it brought up another question that I had. So if I've got an older station and I want to replace some of the piping, or I need to replace some of the parts, are parts interchangeable from different manufacturers? And could I have different types of pipe hooked together so I don't have to remove an entire run of piping? Can you help me understand what that all means? So for instance, I guess when I've had my own experience, my own feeble experience trying to do my own plumbing, I know if I change one part in the plumbing system, that defect is going to carry forward or backward into the system, and I might spring a new leak or something someplace else because I've added pressure on my water line that wasn't there before. So there's really a couple questions here. Are parts interchangeable? Are product type or product manufacturers interchangeable? Can I use different types of piping? Can you answer that question for me, please?
So if we're talking widgets, a complete part is a part. Okay, you can't take a component apart and use somebody else's replacement part or gasket or check valve or something like that. Usually, a complete component that has a listing cannot be altered with something else. So in that regards, it has to be the same manufacturer. But when you're talking like caps and adapters, you could take a brand X cap and adapter and put it on brand Y's, or you take brand X's cap and gasket and put it on brand Y's adapter. That's not a problem. Those are just connecting parts. It's when you actually modify the part itself that becomes a violation to the UL listing and stuff like that. It also gets a little sticky, and Brad, jump in on this, but it also depends on what you're doing. If you have an existing site, and for instance, if you have a spill bucket that has a problem, there may be state regulations, local jurisdiction that says that if you replace like for like, you don't have to apply for a permit within that state to replace that spill bucket. If you replace unlike, meaning a different manufacturer, then you may have to apply for a permit in order to replace that. So there's different local jurisdictions that also get involved on it. There's sometimes grandfather clauses on if you're replacing something below the shear valve at the dispenser. So it gets really kind of sticky. But the good thing is that all these components we're talking about are not things that you and I could just go in as citizens and change like we would a light bulb in our house. Those are typically things, when you're touching anything within the fueling system, that's governed by regulatory or local legislation, meaning Brad's company is certified in certain credentials to do that work. You're going to be hiring those people anyways, so they know what can and cannot be changed out. The few components that we may change ourselves, caps and adapters, nozzles, hoses, those are not typically a problem.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jeff. There's a number of things that you can have a mix and match of the brands, like a line leak detector, for instance, on a submersible turbine pump, which are pretty common across most of the USTs. You can have a different brand of line leak detector installed in a leak detection port. And that's maybe fairly common. We might have brand X on one tank, brand Y in the other tank, and brand Z in the third tank. And they all meet the EPA requirements. They've gone through third-party certifications. They can provide the line leak detection. They're just painted a different color and got a different manufacturers on those. And they would be tested upon installation by the company installing them to make sure they function okay. And so in cases like that, it's not uncommon to have parts that are mixed up. In other cases, like the automatic tank gauging system, all of those electronic sensors would be wired back into that main module inside the store. So that's important that those are not interchanged. And we have seen some cases where someone tried to be a little bit creative, came up with their own homemade sump sensor. And anyone with soldering skills and some basic electrical knowledge could buy fabricate something that would trigger an alarm at the console, but that would not be a legitimate installation. And it's not even legitimate to take a sensor from a different brand of an ATG system and try to install it and make it work. So some things like that are an entire system. They need to have the same make and model, for all the parts that are listed by that manufacturer as being compatible with it.
A key point, Brad, not to mix and match a system. The system is meant to be a system, and especially when you talk about something like the ATG, that's your safety net. That's your whistles and alarms, and last thing you want to do is create a situation where you've made a change to something that's unauthorized and you take on the liability. If you use something that's not made to do that job and there's a release, you take on responsibility for that. So especially with your monitoring equipment, that all should be like for like. The warranty is based on that being like for like. The UL listing is based on all that. So that is critical with that. But once again, those should not be components that any of us should be touching, with the exception of those that are in that field. And once again, if you have a qualified company that's certified with the state, they would lose their credentials with the manufacturers to do work on that type of equipment. So they really should not be doing any of those mix and matches themselves either. That's one thing I would stress, Vicki, all the time, is that anybody that's looking to buy or build a gas station, make sure you check who's doing the work. Ask for their credentials to make sure that they are certified with the state or the proper jurisdiction to do that work, and make sure that they're also authorized by the manufacturer of those pieces of equipment to do the warranty work also, because if they're not, that may also void the warranties.
That's a really great point, Jeff, and I appreciate you making it. We've covered a lot of ground here, and one of the things that I wanted to ask before we wrap up here, there's been a lot of talk about changes in fuels and E15. And there are requirements around that. Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about why the fuel blends are changing and what we can expect going forward?
Sure. Yeah, fuels change for a couple of reasons. Generally, they're either driven by policy changes. For example, diesel fuel was required by Congress. Congress told EPA to set rules over time to make diesel fuel get cleaner. So over a period of 20 years or 15 years, from the late 1990s until the mid 2000s, diesel fuel slowly had less sulfur in it. So that was an example of a policy-driven change. We also have new fuels that come out. Biofuels are a good example as a market-driven change. When corn our corn farmers were really good, grew a lot of corn. We had so much corn, we needed a new market for corn farmers. So ethanol came out in the 1980s, and that market grew. And so now we have 10% ethanol in our systems, when the previous additive for making it burn cleaner phased out because it had some leak problems. So now we have a lot of ethanol, and now it looks like, to your question, the trend is looking like we might have, well, we are having more growth of E15, 15% ethanol. But right now, only about 3,000 or 4,000 stations or so in the country right now are selling E15 at those stations. Most stations will need some changes of equipment to be able to store E15 for those compatibility reasons everybody's spoken about today. But EPA just this week on Monday, so this is a perfect timing. I don't know when this recording will actually play, but today's the 22nd of January. On the 19th, we released a proposal to slightly modify the compatibility requirements. And what that would do is it would make it slightly easier if that rule were to pass for people to use a different way to show that their system is compatible with the fuel being stored. We don't know what will happen with the rule. We can't speculate. I don't know any more than you do. We do have a new administration coming in, and so this was passed. The proposal came out under the old administration. So we'll see what happens. But the trend is that we're seeing more biofuels. That was a long answer to the question. I'm sorry. Brad and Jeff will have something to say here, too. They've got a lot of years.
No, I think that you covered it, Ryan. I mean, there's innovation everywhere, and this industry has been a home to a lot of innovation over the years. And sometimes, the fuels are leading innovation, and the equipment manufacturers, leak detection manufacturers, kind of have to catch up with that. So it's kind of exciting, really. And there will be some hiccups along the way. We've seen some things, some problems that have occurred that we believe were due to some incompatibility with a newer type of fuel in a system that wasn't made for it. And there's a possibility that may happen with other fuels. So hopefully these tools will help owners and operators to assess their systems and really plan for the future. And I would say, back to the very first question, if you're starting from scratch and building something, just to reiterate, look at the best materials that are available and think, hey, maybe I can, maybe it might cost a little bit more, but you get something that's not only good for the current fuels, but is rated for other fuels that we haven't even thought about yet. One of my early jobs, I was installing tanks for a major oil company, and there was an option that came on this big purchase order. I just could check the box. Of course, I was a young engineer. I wasn't given the purchase authority. For a few $100s, I could get a better grade of tank to be installed that would be compatible with methanol blended fuels, which were considered a possibility back in the 80s. And it turns out that my employer did not want to spend that little bit of extra money on those tanks, but it's really kind of a shame. It would have made them compatible with virtually any type of alcohol that ever could have been put in those tanks. And that was before the common, fiberglass tanks were compatible with that. So that's just a kind of a personal experience to think about. Just for a little bit extra money and foresight, you may be able to have a much better future in the fuels that may come along.
I'm going to add to both Ryan and to Brad. I'm going to put on my Fuels Institute hat for a minute. And, I especially by younger people, we're under the impression that electric vehicles are going to take over real soon. So if you take the hard data of fuels and electric vehicles and transportation for light-duty vehicles in the United States, the reality is that we have a huge population of vehicles in the United States, over 260 million light-duty vehicles. And through normal attrition, it's going to be decades before electric vehicles could begin to take foothold. Probably about 2040, maybe 25% of the vehicles in the United States will be electric. The other 75% will be liquid fuels. And based on the renewable fuel standard, and this has been going on for over decades now, we're going to continue to push for additional renewable fuels. And right now, ethanol, E15, seems to be the most flexible product that will allow us to do that. So really, I would say for the next couple decades, especially, you will see that probably be the fuel, unless we come up with other renewable fuels which are required under the Renewable Fuel Standard 2. So far, that hasn't taken place. But either way, our fuels are going to change. The only constant we now know is change. And so we just need to be prepared for that and make sure, because we don't rebuild those stations very often, we need to do it right the first time and make it as universal as possible.
Thanks, Jeff. And you reminded me, I only spoke to half of our requirement in this proposed rule. The other half of the proposed rule, in addition to allowing it some differences in how you can demonstrate compatibility if you have a station existing today, if you put in a new station or anytime you replace a new component, in the proposed rule, the requirement would be that you have to put in a version that is compatible up to 100% ethanol. Like Brad just said, sometimes it's not that much additional cost to have a little bit of difference for each component. It's not insignificant, but if the proposal were to go forward, and again, we don't know what will happen, but if it were to go forward, then that would be just the baseline for all components. The only components that you would be allowed to put in would be those compatible with the whole range of 0% all the way up to 100% ethanol. And we imagine then probably manufacturers would only start, at least for the U.S. market, making those. But we'll see where that goes. But that would open up the range for the future of fuels. But as it stands now, you can still put in various types of options. But these two experts are suggesting that you might want to look at putting in the best you can if you're in a situation when you have the opportunity to put in some new equipment.
Wow. Thanks, gentlemen. We've really covered a lot of ground on this, and I want to thank you for lending your expertise in this introductory chat. You gentlemen will be presenting in individual modules about your area of expertise. And again, I'd like to thank you. I think we covered a lot of ground. I think you've enlightened a lot of people on a lot of different things. And for that, I thank you. And so we'll look forward to meeting with you all again. Thanks and have a great day.